I was mid-brush, scrubbing away at my teeth, when that unmistakable thwack of a hammer hitting wood jolted me awake. At first, I figured someone was patching a fence, or maybe crafting a birdhouse, but then I peeked out my bathroom window and, nearly choked, there were 3 blazer-clad figures driving a wooden stake into the edge of my private pond. Toothpaste went flying as I gaped. One was teetering in heels. Another clutched a clipboard, and the third had the audacity to plant a sign blaring HOA reflection pool, community property. That's when my toothbrush clattered to the floor. I'm Samir, and I own this land, fair and square, that ponds. Been here longer than these suburban clipboard warriors have been alive. What started as a pesky HOA squabble was about to explode into the wildest, frog-infested, spotlight-drenched war this neighborhood had ever witnessed. And trust me, I was done turning the other cheek. Just 3 months earlier, I'd fled the city's relentless noise to nestle into a tranquil wooded community on the town's outskirts. As a freelance biologist and wildlife photographer, all I craved was land, quiet, and nature. I found the perfect spot: a cozy cabin, a thick tree line, and the crown jewel, a private spring-fed pond tucked into the back corner of my yard. It had no name on any official map because it was pure, untouched, serene, and a haven for migrating birds, turtles, and the occasional deer. The real estate agent dubbed it Samir's Sanctuary, and by the time the paperwork was signed, the HOA wasn't even a flicker on my radar, technically bordering it, but not under their thumb. Or so I thought. For weeks, life was bliss. Set up motion sensor cameras to track the local wildlife, started logging frog species, and at night I'd sit by the water, soaking in the gentle croaks and rustling trees, utterly at peace. Then one morning, a flyer changed everything, tucked into my mailbox. It was stamped by the Evergreen Community HOA and titled, "Upcoming Beautification Projects." I ignored it. Nothing to do with me. 2 weeks later, I heard the knock. Standing at my front door was Karen, the HOA president. I didn't know her name yet, but everything about her screamed Karen, from her overly rigid posture to the aggressive smile that never quite reached her eyes. She was flanked by 2 others, a man who looked like he lived at the gym, and a woman who was already scribbling notes. As I opened the door, "Hello, Mr. Samir, right? We just wanted to take a look at the community pond behind your home. It's recently been flagged as a potential shared space for the neighborhood," Karen chirped. Already moving toward my backyard before I could say a word. "That's not a community pond," I replied, stepping in front of them. "It's on my property. It's private, been that way since the 1970s. Karen gave a laugh that felt like someone scraping glass across metal. "Oh, we did a full aerial map review. It's technically within the community's easement zone, so it's going to be reclassified as a reflection pool, part of our Wellness and Serenity initiative." I blinked. "A reflection? What a reflection?" "Pool for aesthetic peace. It'll be on our HOA map, and we'll be putting up a sign and clearing out the wild clutter. You'll receive a landscaping guide shortly." I was too stunned to respond. Not only were they completely wrong about the property lines, but they were also acting like they already owned the place. I told them I'd have to look into it and shut the door before I said something impolite that night. I went digging. I found the surveyor's map from the county. Every inch of that pond was inside my boundary lines, clearly and legally mine. I printed out the documents, highlighted the pond, and even laminated them in case Karen returned. I figured that would be enough. It wasn't the next morning the sign went up. They didn't even ask. 2 HOA volunteers, both high schoolers from the neighborhood, were given orders to install a wooden post at the edge of my pond. I found them mid-task, looking uncomfortable, but obedient, holding a sign that declared the area a community reflection pool. I asked them politely to stop. They said they were just following HOA instructions. When I yanked the sign out of the ground, they scurried off like startled squirrels. I thought that was the end of it. Then came the fairy lights on the third night. As I stepped onto my back porch with a cup of tea, I noticed something odd. Tiny specks of light were dancing around the pond. Upon closer inspection, I saw solar-powered fairy lights strung between trees and bushes, illuminating the water in a soft, artificial glow. It was absurd. My wild pond looked like the set of a wedding photo shoot. Then I saw Karen standing across the pond on the far end of the property line, pointing at the lights with a satisfied expression, while her assistant filmed her monologuing about serenity zones and community wellness. I lost it quietly, but completely. I didn't shout. I didn't stomp over and rip down the lights. I didn't call the police. Instead, I turned back inside and made a list. I titled it Operation Amphibian Chaos, and it started with the words, Step 1, Frogs. I knew frogs. I had studied frogs. I had even written academic articles about the importance of vocal amphibians in regulating insect populations. I also knew that during mating season, certain species, especially bullfrogs, could reach decibel levels loud enough to be mistaken for motorcycles. My pond wasn't just a water feature, it was the perfect biological trap, and now it would become the loudest, brightest, most biologically disruptive reflection pool they had ever seen. First, I began introducing more frogs into the ecosystem, carefully selected species, sourced ethically from local conservatories and breeding programs. I adjusted the water pH to accommodate breeding. I added logs and paths for prime croaking platforms. Then I installed motion-triggered lights that bathed the pond in sterile, white light every time a frog moved, ensuring the nocturnal ambience was completely ruined for any stereo reflection. Seekers, I wasn't just defending my land, I was turning it into a fortress of natural chaos, biologically accurate, legally untouchable, and annoyingly perfect. And Karen had no idea that by claiming my pond as her own, she'd just stepped into the weirdest war of her life. Let the croaking begin. The first few nights of Operation Amphibian Chaos were quiet, too quiet. I had introduced a dozen mature bullfrogs into the pond, and another few dozen tadpoles I had been raising in a controlled environment in my basement for weeks. The moment I released them into the wild, it was as if they knew they had a mission. The bullfrogs wasted no time establishing territory, and their deep-throated croaks began echoing across the waterline. By the third evening, their calls had intensified, and by the fifth, the entire area was alive with a cacophony that could rival a rock concert. But I wasn't done. That was only the beginning. Next came the lights. I had always been fascinated by how animals adapted to urban environments, and it was time to reverse engineer that idea. I picked up for solar-powered floodlights meant for football fields, each fitted with sensors and remote control capabilities. I disguised them in decorative rock enclosures, the kind you might see in a landscaped backyard at dusk. The pond came alive with an aggressive glow that could light up a stadium. I aimed the beams at various angles across the surface of the water, ensuring reflections bounced off the ripples and lit up the surrounding trees. The entire place looked like a wildlife fashion runway. Karen's peaceful reflection pool had officially transformed into a croaking, glaring, buzzing spectacle. The reaction was swift. At 10:07 p.m. that night, my phone vibrated with an unknown number. I let it go to voicemail. 30 seconds later, it rang again. I finally picked up on the third call. It was Karen, and she was furious. She accused me of weaponizing amphibians and excessively illuminating common areas. I calmly reminded her that the pond was not a common area, nor did her HOA have jurisdiction over it. She insisted that the board had voted to recognize it as such. But when I asked her to produce the deed or survey map supporting her claim, she changed the subject to noise ordinances. That was her first tactical mistake. I had already pulled the county guidelines, and frogs were listed under protected wildlife activity. She had no legal standing to silence nature. The next morning, a small group from the HOA came by to assess environmental damage. I watched them through binoculars from my upstairs window as they peered into the pond with disgust. Karen wore a wide-brimmed sun hat and sunglasses, like she was surveying a toxic waste site. Her assistant held a decibel meter, frowning every time it spiked due to a crop. One member actually plugged his ears and yelled about nighttime terrorism. I chuckled into my coffee. What they didn't know was that I had started looping audio. I had previously recorded bullfrog calls at high fidelity and built a hidden speaker system into the surrounding brush. The playback was randomized, set at slightly varied intervals and frequencies to avoid sounding artificial, so even if they managed to chase the frogs off, one night the croaks would still echo relentlessly. To top it off, I introduced a few peepers, tiny tree frogs with piercing calls that could slice through any silence. Like a fire alarm, their chirps, multiplied and amplified by strategically placed speakers, were like nature's revenge sirens. Later that day, a new sign appeared on my gate, stapled like a wanted poster. It was a formal HOA violation notice, stating that I had been creating an artificial nuisance inconsistent with community peace. I didn't bother removing it. Instead, I posted a laminated copy of the county wildlife ordinance just below it, along with my property's boundary survey. Anyone who took the time to read would understand that the HOA had no jurisdiction, but reading wasn't their strong suit. Harassing, on the other hand, was that evening I noticed something even more ridiculous. 2 HOA members parked their golf carts side by side right at the edge of my property and began blasting classical opera on portable speakers. It was a strange attempt at sound warfare, as if Mozart would neutralize the frogs. I let them play their symphony for about 20 minutes before I activated my emergency backup system, a low-frequency rumble speaker embedded under the soil near the fence. It was harmless, but created enough ground tremor to unsettle small speakers. The music skipped one of the golf carts, rolled slightly downhill. The men panicked and drove off, looking behind them as if ghosts had pushed their carts. The community began to split. Growing number of neighbors found the whole situation hilarious. Someone even made a meme account titled Frog Wars HOA Edition, where they posted short videos of the nightly noise, along with Karen's meltdowns caught on camera. The younger families were especially entertained. A group of kids began painting little frog-shaped rocks and placing them around the neighborhood, calling them Frog Scouts. My mailbox received more thank you notes than hate mail. for the first time since I moved in. But Karen wasn't done, not by a long shot. She called for an emergency HOA board meeting, and I received an unsolicited invite taped to my door, probably meant to intimidate me. I attended out of curiosity. It was held at the community clubhouse, and every chair was filled. Karen stood at the podium like she was launching a Senate campaign. Friends, neighbors, and fellow community caretakers, she began, voice trembling with frustration. We are under siege. A natural sanctuary has been perverted into a noise-polluting, overlit, piston-fusted bog. I raised my hand. Yes, she said, fake smile cracking at the corners. Just a point of order. Your bylaws encourage native wildlife support and low-impact decorative lighting. That pond meets both. I can provide documentation if needed. The room murmured. Karen's face twitched. It's not about frogs, Mr. Samir. It's about respect for shared spaces. But it's not a shared space, I replied calmly. Again, legally, that land is mine. County records show it, and unless your HOA rules supersede property law, I think this discussion is more philosophical than enforceable. The room tilted. One of the newer board members asked if we could table the conversation until legal review. Karen snapped at him, accusing him of siding with chaos. The meeting ended in a quiet mess that night as the pond sang its croaky lullaby beneath its shining lights. I sat on my porch with a lemonade and marveled at how quickly absurdity had bloomed into something beautiful. The frogs were thriving, the neighborhood was buzzing, and Karen was unraveling faster than a $2 lawn chair in a thunderstorm. Still, I wasn't foolish. I knew the escalation wasn't over. Karen was persistent, petty, predictably entitled. If she couldn't beat the frogs legally, she would find another route. But what she didn't know was that I had more than frogs, lights, and speakers in my toolbox. I had the truth, I had the law, and soon I would have the upper hand in a way she never saw coming. The quiet before the storm didn't last long. Karen's tolerance had clearly reached its limit, and just as I suspected, she wasn't going to take the croaking, the lights, or the mounting neighborhood ridicule lying down. Her next move came not with noise or confrontation, but with an official letter delivered not by mail but taped to my door in bright red ink, the HOA logo at the top like a badge of misplaced authority. The letter accused me of introducing non-native invasive species into a shared ecosystem and alleged that my lighting caused light pollution hazardous to nocturnal wildlife migration patterns. I nearly choked on my tea reading it, the irony of being accused of harming wildlife by the same woman who wanted to replace a frog-filled pond with a sterile reflection pool. Wasn't lost on me, but this wasn't just posturing anymore. Karen was trying to build a legal case. I knew exactly how she was going to move next. If the HOA could not win on jurisdiction, then she would attempt to paint me as a reckless landowner who posed an ecological threat to the broader area. So I countered with a little legal insurance of my own. I reached out to my colleague, Dr. Aldridge, a senior ecologist at the State University. She owed me a favor after I edited her field research reports. Last year, within 48 hours, she arrived with her team, clipboards in hand, ready to perform a formal ecological survey of the pond. They spent 3 full days documenting everything: that frog population, water quality, insect balance, and vegetation impact. Their report didn't just clear me, it praised the pond's biodiversity as a model for suburban mike habitat. The frogs weren't invasive, they were native, and the lighting fully compliant with wildlife safety guidelines, using warm spectrum bulbs that limited insect disorientation and were only active for 4 hours. Each night I had scientific backing, and Karen had speculation, but she didn't back down. Instead, she turned petty. Her new tactic was sound warfare. At exactly 900 p.m. every night, she started playing opera from her second-story balcony, not the classy kind either. Full-volume distorted speakers screeching out arias that made my windows tremble. For the first night or two I laughed it off. Then I retaliated, not with more noise, but with scheduling. I shifted the frog call loop to begin at 5 o'clock a.m. just before sunrise, which meant Karen's restful hours were now bookended by chaos. My speakers, though, were directional and low enough to blend with the real frogs making them. Impossible to pinpoint or blame outright hers. They echoed like a cheap concert. By the end of the week, a different neighbor reported her to the city for violating the noise ordinance. But it was her next move that made me realize just how far she was willing to go. I woke up one morning to find the perimeter of my backyard lined with orange construction flags. They hadn't been there the night before. A quick check with the city planning office revealed that someone had filed a request for a utility survey citing plans for a community meditation deck and footpath extending from the street straight through my backyard down to the pond. Karen was trying to build a path to a place she didn't own. The audacity was astounding. I called my lawyer, had a cease and desist order drafted immediately, and presented it to the HOA board. At their next meeting, Karen tried to object, rambling about historical community use and collective benefit. But when I presented the time-stamped aerial photos from the last 30 years showing the pond untouched and privately maintained, her words fell apart. Then I pulled out the big guns. My legal documentation showing the property was purchased before the HOA was incorporated, meaning they had no power over my land. The room went quiet. One board member actually let out a quiet laugh. Karen's face twisted with barely suppressed rage. But, as expected, when one route closed, she tried another. A week later, I was visited by a county inspector, apparently following up on a complaint regarding illegal outdoor construction. I gave him a tour, showed him every permit I had filed, and he left impressed, even complimenting the educational aspect of the frog habitat. He especially liked the lecture platform. I had started building a wooden deck with 6 seats facing the pond, which I had quietly submitted a permit 4 weeks earlier. When I explained that I was planning to host weekend amphibian awareness talks for local schools and nature groups, he smiled and said, "That's actually amazing." Words spread quickly. I emailed every environmental science teacher within a 30 meters radius, and within 2 weeks, I had confirmed attendees from 3 schools and a scout troop. The first talk was set for a Saturday morning, and I went all out. I printed handouts, created posters of native frog species, and prepared small jars of pond water for microscope viewing. The floodlights remained off, replaced by morning sunlight. The croaks were replaced with educational enthusiasm. Kids sat on the deck and listened intently. Parents took pictures. One even asked if I gave private biology tutoring. Karen, standing at her window in a bathrobe, looked like she'd swallowed a lemon whole. The backlash against the HOA began to swell. A neighbor who previously stayed neutral approached me after the lecture. He admitted that he had initially supported Karen's reflection pool idea, thinking it would raise property values, but seeing the community come together around something educational and natural had changed his perspective, he said. Honestly, this is the first time my son's been excited about science outside of a screen. I don't care about reflection anymore. This is way better. Karen, however, remained undeterred. Her latest accusation was that my pond posed a safety risk: mosquito breeding grounds, potential drowning hazard, unstable terrain. It was laughable, especially since I had added mosquito-inducing water plants and even posted safety signs around the perimeter for good measure. But I saw the move for what it was. She was setting the stage for a formal complaint to the HOA's legal department. That's when I decided to go fully on the offensive with Dr. Aldrich's help. I filed a formal environmental designation request with the State Conservation Office. It was an obscure but powerful program that allowed unique microecosystems in residential areas to receive official recognition, which would offer legal protection against interference or development. The process was tedious, but with my background and her endorsement, we were fast-tracked. By the end of the third week, I received confirmation the pond had been listed as a protected private habitat. Under state code, any future HOA interference would now be considered obstruction of a state-sanctioned ecological site. I laminated that certificate and nailed it to a post right next to the pond. I made sure the letters were big enough to read. From Karen's porch the next day, Karen sent out an email to the HOA mailing list. One final desperate rant. She accused me of manipulating the system, turning the community against her, and abusing wildlife for personal amusement. She referred to my pond as a blight upon an otherwise elegant neighborhood, but by now no one was listening. People had seen the truth with their own eyes. Kids were sketching frogs in their notebook. Teachers were inviting me to classrooms. Even the city council sent me a thank. The final tantrum didn't come with an announcement or a formal letter. It came quietly, like all desperate acts do, under the cloak of night and cowardice. At first, I didn't notice anything was wrong. The frogs were unusually quiet evening, but I attributed it to the mild weather shift. Sometimes storms brewing miles away could affect their behavior. It wasn't until I walked down to the pond the next morning with a fresh cup of coffee that I saw the dead frogs floating in clusters near the edge, their bodies stiff, their eyes glazed over with a stillness I recognized instantly. Something had poisoned them. My heart sank. The water stank faintly of chemicals, not the usual earthy scent I had grown so fond of. I dipped a test strip and waited. The color turned an ugly shade of orange bleach. Someone had poured bleach into my pond. I stood there in stunned silence, fury growing in my chest. By the second I looked around, there were faint shoe prints in the mud, leading from the HOA pathway toward the back end of the pond. The grass was slightly flattened. Whoever had done this had been in a hurry. They had cut through the fence's side gap and tossed in the poison like some unhinged exterminator. And I knew exactly who it was. Karen. No one else had a motive. No one else had spent the last 2 months obsessing over my pond, trying everything in her power to control or destroy it. But what she didn't know, what she had forgotten or underestimated, was that I had installed 3 wildlife motion detection cameras around the perimeter of the pond, not just to observe animals, but to protect the area from trespassers. I ran inside, pulled the memory cards, and reviewed the footage at exactly 2:41 a.m. There she was, Karen herself, wearing all black hair stuffed under a hoodie. Carrying a white jug with a spray nozzle, she crouched low by the water, sprayed the liquid in long arcs, then tossed the empty container into the bushes and scurried back. The way she came, her face was partially obscured, but the profile was unmistakable. Her distinct gait, her side-deep parted hair that escaped from the hoodie, even the gold charm on her keychain that jangled as she walked. I had her, I had everything. I didn't call her, I didn't confront her, I called the police. The responding officers were skeptical at first, likely assuming this was another HOA squabble gone too far, but once they saw the footage and smelled the pond, they took it seriously. One officer collected samples, while the other reviewed my property map and confirmed that the pond was indeed private land. A few hours later, Karen was picked up from her home. They didn't cuff her, but the sight of two officers walking her down her pristine driveway in full view of her neighbors was more than enough. I watched from across the street as she turned and stared at me. Her face wasn't angry, it was empty, like someone who had just realized the hole they dug was too deep to climb. Out of the story spread like wildfire. Within 24 hours, the footage had gone viral, thanks to a local journalist who picked up the story and framed it as an environmental crime against protected wildlife. Headlines read, "HOA President Poisons Pond," "Suburban Sabotage the Frog Massacre," and my personal favorite, "Karen versus the Croak." Environmentalists rallied behind the incident. Donations poured in for a wildlife recovery initiative. By the end of the week, I had been contacted by 3 nonprofits, to podcast hosts, and a documentary filmmaker, asking for interviews. Karen was charged with environmental damage, trespassing, and tampering with a protected habitat. The judge issued a no-contact order preventing her from setting foot within 50 feet of my property. Her bond conditions required her to attend mandatory environmental ethics classes. The HOA board convened an emergency vote and unanimously removed her from her position. That was the only unanimous vote they had ever achieved, from what I was told. But I didn't stop there. With the community support behind me, I filed a civil lawsuit seeking damages for property destruction, emotional distress, and ecological harm. It was the kind of lawsuit that came with public hearings and depositions. Karen, now a walking cautionary tale, had to sit in court as lawyers detailed how she had systematically harassed, threatened, and ultimately poisoned my land out of spite. Her defense attorney attempted to argue mental duress and neighborhood tension, but the video evidence shredded any sympathy the court might have offered. Her credibility was in ruins, her social standing obliterated, and her name now a punchline at every HOA meeting and neighborhood potluck. What came next was unexpected. The new HOA leadership reached out. The interim president, a level-headed, retired school principal named Cheryl, asked to meet over coffee on my porch. She apologized on behalf of the board. She admitted they had let Karen run wild for too long and failed to step in when things spiraled. She offered a symbolic olive branch, a proposal to partner with me to create a community eco-reserve initiative, not just around my pond, but encouraging other residents to support small-scale wildlife effort. She wanted to turn the story around, use it as a lesson, and avoid another Karen situation ever again. I considered it, and after reviewing the terms, I agreed it would allow for community involvement without giving them authority over my land. I would remain the lead biologist, and all plans would require my approval. It wasn't about making peace, it was about ensuring that my autonomy was never challenged again under the false banner of community improvement. With Karen gone, the energy in the neighborhood shifted. Kids who once giggled at the drama were now attending. My weekend wildlife talks with curiosity parents brought snacks and folding chairs. Someone even offered to help replant the vegetation around the pond. The frogs slowly returned, their chorus rising night after night, each croak a small victory. And Karen, she moved. She sold her home at a loss and disappeared from our lives. Rumor had it she tried to join another HOA across town, but when their board Googled her name and saw the articles and video footage, her application was quietly denied. The final act came months later. With the help of the state environmental agency, we installed a small bronze plaque on the edge of the pond. It read, "Samir's Sanctuary, dedicated to the protection of native species and the right to private stewardship." Below, it etched into the metal, was a quote I chose carefully. "When they tried to silence the frogs, they only made them louder." As I stood there that evening, floodlights gently illuminating the water, the frogs croaking in a familiar rhythm, I felt something I hadn't in months. Peace, not the kind that comes from silence, but the kind you earn when you stand up to bullies, outsmart the entitled, and defend what's rightfully yours, with brains, patience, and just enough spite to light up a pond. It had been 3 quiet weeks since Karen had moved out. Her house, once obsessively maintained, now sat on the market with an unflattering price drop and a long-forgotten for sale sign that leans slightly to the right. The grass had grown wild. The shutters were closed tight, and the neighborhood seemed to breathe easier without her presence. But I wasn't celebrating with champagne or smug victory dances. Instead, I was preparing for something more lasting, something bigger than revenge, something permanent. The idea came to me one evening as I sat by the pond watching the water shimmer under a soft glow from the eco-friendly floodlights. The frogs were back, less in number than before, but croaking with renewed vigor. It felt like they too had survived a war. I thought about everything that had happened, the sabotage, the accusations, the night Karen crept onto my land with a jug of bleach, and realized that this battle was never just about a pond. It was about ownership, identity, and the right to live without being bullied by someone whose power came from paper rules and a false sense of superiority. I wanted something that would turn the story into more than gossip. I wanted it to become legend. I started by organizing what I jokingly called the grand finale. I invited every neighbor who had supported me, all the teachers who brought students to the lectures, and a few local journalists who had followed the pond drama from the beginning. I also extended invites to environmental groups and city officials. I called it Frog Talk, not a protest, not a party, something in between. It would be a celebration of native wildlife, community resilience, and stubbornness that refused to yield. On the night of Frog Talk, the backyard transformed into something magical. Lanterns lined the path from my gate to the pond's edge. A temporary stage was set up with a local folk band performing light acoustic songs themed around nature, and rebellion food trucks parked outside. The property line offered everything from tacos to vegan cupcake. Children ran around with glow sticks shaped like frogs, and volunteers handed out booklets about native amphibians, each one featuring fun facts and the names of all the species identified. In the pond, at the center of it all, stood the pond alive with movement and color. I had installed a set of synchronized lights that pulsed gently in time with the croaking, a sort of visual symphony that highlighted each sound the deck I built. For wildlife lectures now held people laughing, eating, and appreciating something that had once been targeted for destruction. There were even frog-shaped cookies and a donation box that went toward a new school nature program. Every detail was intentional. This wasn't just revenge, it was redefine. One of the highlights of the evening came when a neighbor's teenage son, a tech whiz, projected a short video compilation onto a fabric screen mounted near the trees. It was a montage of the whole saga: Karen's signposting, stunt her rants at HOA meetings, snippets of her opera warfare, and finally, the infamous bleach footage that sealed her downfall. The crowd laughed, gasped, and cheered in all the right places. I stood at the back, arms folded, watching it unfold like a documentary that had started with a trespass and ended with a lesson. But the biggest surprise came just as the video ended. A woman stepped up to the microphone on stage. She introduced herself as Rebecca, a producer working on a limited documentary series called Neighbors from Hell, which would be airing on a major streaming platform. She said she had followed my story for weeks, had spoken to the environmental board and the HOA, and wanted to include the pond war as a featured episode. I was stunned. My story was going national. I nodded and smiled, already knowing how I wanted it to be told, not as a petty turf war, but as a cautionary tale about how power can be abused when unchecked, and how sometimes the best way to fight back isn't with fists or fury, but frogs. After the party ended and the last of the guests left, I walked around the pond alone. The water was calm, reflecting the moon, and for the first time in months, the silence wasn't a warning. It was comfort. I thought about Karen. I wondered where she had gone, if she was sitting in a cramped apartment somewhere bitterly scrolling through the coverage of the event. I didn't hate her anymore. I pitied her, because no matter how much power she thought she had, in the end, she'd underestimated the one thing that never folds under pressure: someone who has nothing left to prove and everything worth protecting. A week after Frog Talk, I received a small box in the mail. It had no return address. Inside was a ceramic frog, hand-painted with gold flakes, and a tiny note that read, "Thank you for standing up. We watched the live stream from Colorado. You made us proud. The Tadpole Society." I laugh, apparently. I had a fan club, but the story didn't end with the party, or the plaque, or the article features. It carried on in subtle, permanent ways. The HOA restructured its charter to include an environmental oversight committee. Guess who they asked to chair it? I declined, recommending instead a neighbor who had taken to gardening native wildflowers. After attending one of my talks, the schools began scheduling quarterly field trips to observe amphibian habitats and teach children about the importance of ecosystem balance. Local universities contacted me, asking for permission to use my land as a case study in residential conservation. I also wrote a children's book, partly out of boredom and partly out of catharsis. It was called Freddy the Frog Fights the HHO. It followed a brave little frog who had his home threatened by a bossy goose named Karen, who wanted to drain the swamp and build a mirror pool. The illustrations were charming, the humor subtle but scathing, and the ending full of hope. It became a local bestseller. Teachers emailed me photos of their students holding copies. Libraries invited me to read aloud. At one point, I saw a Reddit thread titled "Best Petty Book of the Year," and there was Freddy on top of the list. As for the pond, it healed slowly. The water cleared, new life returned, and the frogs multiplied. I planted more trees, introduced dragonflies to control mosquitoes, and built small bridges for observation walk. I even added benches made from recycled wood. It wasn't just a pond anymore. It was a sanctuary, not just for wildlife, but for anyone who ever felt overwhelmed by a system that told them to sit down and shut up. The frogs didn't sit. They sang one morning as I sipped coffee and looked out over the misty water. I heard a soft voice behind me. It was Cheryl, the new HOA president. She smiled and asked, half joking, if I'd ever consider hosting a meditation class on the pond deck. I laughed long and hard. Then I nodded and said, only if it ended with frog-themed yoga poses. We both stood there in comfortable silence. Two neighbors finally understanding that peace doesn't come from control, but respect. And so the war that started with a stake in the mud and a sign that didn't belong ended not with violence or vengeance, but with laughter, light, and 1,000 croaks echoing into the dusk, claiming their home, one ribbit at a time.